Shining bright lotus.
And welcome all to our Saturday morning practice. It's a good thing to get together and practice. I'm going to talk a little bit. The focus here is on the emotional koans of Junpo Roshi, and I want to kind of put it in context because I don't think it's ever really been put in context. And then we'll we'll move toward using emotional koans as sort of an ongoing practice. Junpo Roshi was ordained and was received Inka from Edo Shimano in the Rinzai lineage. The Rinzai lineage, as it lands in 21st century America, was essentially a formulation of Hakuin Ekaku, who lived in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The koans in the Rinzai form were offered in a curriculum. There's two styles of curriculum. That's probably too much detail to get into the nature of it. But overall, the idea of Hakuin's work is that the basic experience of kensho, which is the awakening experience, is the beginning of the journey rather than the landing, the arriving of the journey. And in order to really understand the terrain, the potential of this awakening experience, one is taken through a series of mental directives, let's just say, koans. The koans themselves are a lot of traditional teachings from the Chan, which is the Chinese era of Buddhism, which is basically, not really 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century is not really a lot from the 6th century. And they were formulated in the 11th and 12th century into texts, essentially. The Blue Cliff Record being the text that's most commonly used in the Rinzai curriculum. Junpo spent about many years, I was going to say 12, that might be not an accurate number, at Daibasatsu Monastery. And so what would happen in a traditional koan structure is that you're meditating on sesshin, which is the 8-day form, or on a kese, which is a 90-day form. And you have regular repeated meetings with the teacher called Dokusan. And in that meeting, you are having the dialogue with the koan. So the teacher is looking to see if you are your insight with the koan, and you may pass and be given another one, or you may be sent back to your meditation to work on it again, or you may be given what's called a checking question. A checking question is, well, you have the basic understanding of the koan, but we want to make sure that you really embody the full meaning of the koan. It's a wonderful, interesting process. It's not the only way of practicing Buddhism. It's not the only way of practicing Zen. In contrast, the Soto form of using Zen is, Soto's orientation is much more on shikantaza and learning to be present for what is arising. And the koans are often used as teaching vehicles. So they're used in Dharma talks, like what we're doing here, as a way of understanding and learning about the Dharma, the history, and the system of Zen history, essentially. There are other forms of Buddhism that don't use koans at all, and it's not like this is the right way or the only way. Junpo's experience was that with koans being the orientation toward awakening, toward enlightenment, toward moving beyond the notion of the ego self, one would think and hope and pray that you would become a kinder person. And his experience of being in the monastery was that was not really so necessary. And so he began to make a distinction between the awakening process and the what we would call the growing up process. In the growing up process, me being learning how to live with your fellow humankind in some way or another. And so he took this particular, we'll call it technology, you could also call it a method of koan introspection and dialogue, okay, because it's both an introspective inquiry and a dialogue with another person. And he applied it to the emotions, to our feelings. Okay, I'm going to use the language feelings and emotions interchangeably, and I understand and recognize that in many circles there is a technical difference between the two. For example, you could say Damasio actually talks about feelings as just the natural responses that we have, and emotions being the actual like story and the construct that goes along in response to the feelings. So feelings are like we sense something, and then as we interpret it, we have emotions. But there are several different ways of distinguishing feelings and emotions, and for our purposes, we're going to use them all in the same way. And, however, when we go back to the Buddha's teaching, Shakyamuni Buddha, just to be clear, they use the word feelings to describe the I'm attracted to something, I'm averse to something, or I don't care about something. Okay, and that is you can say that those are feelings. I feel good about it, I feel bad about it, I don't care about it. But it's a very simplistic approach in terms of what we've learned over the 25 centuries since the Buddha talked. And so we can definitely say that the traditional Pali Canon teachings did not really address emotions. And we can also say that the Blue Cliff Record did not address emotions. And so it really is, and it kind of makes sense if we look at the evolution of consciousness, that as we got into the 19th century and William James comes along and Freud comes along, that we began to understand the feeling emotional complex of our relationship with feelings and emotions evolved. And we started to understand them better. I mean, we all take for granted the notion that we can fall in love and romantically be carried away by someone, but many folks would say that that's only been about 4 or 5 centuries that's even a thing. Essentially, that was not 2,000 years ago. People didn't fall in love and get carried away by their emotions for wanting to bond with another human being. So we evolve. And one of the key pieces of that is our understanding of emotions have evolved too. And so for the most of that 20th century, we had a sense that there were universal emotions. There were universal that you looked across different cultures, you would see that they're all could agree on a sort of a sense of fear or a sense of anger or pride or hurt. And in the 21st century, we're coming to understand that research isn't really holding up, and that we have what's called the theory of constructed emotions. And it's interesting because the theory of constructed emotions sounds a lot like what Shakyamuni Buddha said 2,500 years ago about everything, which is that who we are and everything that we do is actually arises from our relationships that we have in the world. We learn it. And there aren't. So if I take two people, they may actually learn to experience fear in vastly different ways. So if I was raised in a war zone, fear would be one thing, and if I was raised in a commune somewhere in the country, it would be a different thing. It's a really and so the words are point at different things, and that actually is very much consistent with what Shakyamuni Buddha's notion of dependent origination, or everything arises in relationship with everything else. There is no thing, fear, or thing, anger. That's very much consistent with that particular teaching. And it's interesting because when we look at the Mondo form, or Mondo Zen facilitation, the form, Junpo had not heard of the theory of constructed emotions, but he had a term for it. He called it the hysterical historical. Okay, and it's interesting that now that the science is caught up, the hysterical historical is the notion that ourselves has developed a set of feeling responses, emotional responses, and we can take our Buddhist technology of learning to be present for what's arising and be compassionate with that response, and we can also then take this koan technology and begin to work with these emotions in a way that will reinforce the experience that hopefully we're having of the awakening process. So I'm going to repeat that one again. If koan work is the work that you do after you've had a kensho experience, then one would say that emotional koan work assumes that you're having the experience at some point or another of the mind quieting down and becoming aware of awareness, pure awareness, clear deep heart mind. So the Mondo Zen facilitation form starts with the first 10 koans, which is to point out clear deep heart mind, saying this is available to you, me, us, all of us, all the time. If we practice quieting the mind, we can become familiar, we can become aware of this awareness, we can allow it to filter in our life, and then the training becomes, how do I apply this to my emotional reactivity? Makes sense when we describe it like that. So I had a big brain moment, like wow, that makes sense. The emotional koan section actually starts in koan 10, not in koan 11. Okay, so koan 10 is what feeling arises when you have this experience of clear deep heart mind. It doesn't say clear deep heart mind in the actual koan because it's in sequence. So I want to start there because the idea of putting the word feeling in there is a pretty different thing. So you can look through the Blue Cliff Record and the Mumonkan and the Book of Serenity, and very seldom, I wouldn't say it never, would a koan point to feelings. And if they did point to feelings, they would likely be pointing to not having any, moving beyond them, right? So for a koan to say, okay, now that you're having all these awakening, you're, experiencing no self, your mind's quiet down. The question is, can you share with me, with us in the dialogue, what the feeling is? That's the first emotional koan, really. Okay, and so it's a really important moment in the work as facilitators to go from transcending to descending to we're moving into what's going on with these feelings. How do these feelings relate to this experience of awakening? And I think it's fair to say that on this call, and for many of the folks that we hang out with in these Zen worlds, it's a very joyful, blissful experience. It's like it's like it's wonderful. In Junpo language, it's we get the joke. We recognize that we're not solid and there's a lot of fluidity here, and compassion is the nature of this game in some way or another. So that's koan 9. I'm sorry, 10, koan 10. And then we move into what's called the emotional koan section of the Manda Zen facilitation, which is 11, 12, and 13. And we start off in the introduction with the idea of feelings or information. Okay, and so feelings or information is okay. This is actually this is a modernized version of the Lankavatara Sutra, which basically says, well, there's 5 senses, and then the 6th sense is the emotional body. Like this feeling stuff, emotions. The 7th sense is this sort of the way the mind organizes. So you could say it's metacognition. It's like the fact that the whole computer called the person can actually operate and make sense of all this stuff. That's the 7th one. And the 8th is consciousness, is this what we inherit, the something called the storehouse. This is where you could say karma, right? It's like how the past is so imprinted on ourselves that it shows up in our present. And for many of us here, we recognize that the past doesn't have to be like thousands of years of cultural thing. The past can just be the habits that we learned when we were children that seem to keep showing up over and over and over again. We don't, whether we like it or not. There's a lot of inertia in our styles of life, right? And even though we spend a lot of time not identifying with it, it's interesting how well our nervous system is designed to reproduce styles of behavior, right? And those are our patterns. So that's why we end up in Zen particularly, but in most of Buddhism, recognizing that practice never ceases, because we're sort of have to deal with, we never quite know what's going to arise out of this nervous system until we notice that it arose out of our nervous system. So feelings are information, and so now what are we going to do with this information? And so Junpo's orientation is a particular cluster of feelings. And you can see this is where his bias is. His cluster is anger, shame, and disconnection. And much of that particular cluster, we now in our emotional koan work talk about them being, that has to do with the anger family, essentially. And his question is what are the feelings that, the koan is what are the feelings that arise under anger, shame, and disconnection? And in this particular case, what he's doing, what I like to say, is beginning to recognize that feelings and emotions are way more nuanced, and that often while we're tending to one strong emotional response, there's a lot more going on there if we slow way down, which is Junpo's language for notice some of the subtleties. And in the koan itself, the unpacking goes to fear, sadness, but the point of that particular koan is that we wouldn't be having this response in any way, shape, or form if it didn't matter to us. He uses the word care, but I'm going to sort of simplify it. If it doesn't matter to me, I don't notice it. Let's go all the way back to the first teaching. I'm interested in it, I'm attracted, I'm averse, or who cares? If it's who cares, then you probably won't get angry, or you won't disconnect, or you won't have shame. You'll only have those things if there's some sort of attraction or aversion, right? It matters. And so he wraps this koan around it's because I care. It matters to me. And this is an important piece because this goes back to Shakyamuni, that idea that the entire Buddhist logic is all based on the idea that I'm doing this because I care. Right? If I didn't care, then it doesn't really matter. Why bother? just have your candy and call it a day. But we're all busy practicing and we care. Okay. And so that learning that to recognize that our emotional responses are telling us what matters to us allows us to then begin to deconstruct what's going on, which is the 12th koan, which is specific to this cluster. Can anyone make you angry, shame you, or make you disconnect? And this is the point of number 11 is it matters, and point of number 12 is it's all my responsibility. It's all coming from me. It's not coming from the outside, right? It's my delusion. Okay, so it's like I'm attracted, I'm averse, it matters, and guess what? It has nothing to do with anybody else but what's inside me. It's my stuff, right? Which is a kind of a good lesson. So we set that up, it matters, it's mine. Now what are we going to do with it? Koan 13. What are we going to do with it? We're going to practice. Okay, we're going to practice what we've learned on the cushion. Okay, what we've learned on the cushion is to settle our minds. We learn how to speed up settling our minds. We learn over time through enough practice that our minds can settle at the ring of a bell. There's a term for this in the Dzogchen Mahamudra, which is immediacy. Coming to terms with the idea that the awakening moment doesn't take any time. It's available at any time, which is why the Mondo facilitation uses 2-minute intervals. We're training ourselves to speed that thing up. And if we practice enough, that could be what is often termed in Mondo facilitation drop. Drop into clear, deep heart mind. It's not the best word for it. Maybe it's drop thinking so we can arrive. Okay? Which goes back to that koan, does a dog have Buddha nature? But that's neither here nor there. Somehow we need to, we begin to learn that we have the access to this ever-present living divine mystery. And all we need to do is move the obscurations out of the way. Before we move the obscurations out of the way, though, we've learned, and this is all our work now, that we probably need to slow way down and be with them, which Junpo calls get the information. So the first thing, it's almost like we go in reverse. The first, like, oh shit, that's me reacting. That's the 12th koan. Right? Oh, I care. Okay, let me spend a minute or two just being with what's arising here. Now, we have a lot of different techniques that we do to unpack that. One of the simplest ones is, well, let me welcome it in here. So for a lot of us, when we're having emotional activity, we want to get rid of it. So the first thing is welcome it in. Just allow ourselves to be with it. That's generally a good enough practice, but there's a lot more that we can do with that. But the idea is allow myself to have it in my mind, in my heart, my body. And then in the traditional 13th koan, from there, the invitation is to ring the bell and remember and choose clear, deep heart mind. And then be able to now, from this much more wider stance, much more awakened stance, this stance that is so much recognizing that we are not separate from everything, look back into this emotional construct and be with it now. And with this moment, often the case is we can respond differently. We understand and recognize our emotions from a different place. We take responsibility for it, we care, and what do we really care about? That becomes the question. Sounds pretty good when we describe it this particular way. So in the traditional teaching of Junpo, if you can call it traditional teaching, you with a facilitator work with one person, you pick a particular scenario so that you can go home and practice it on the scenario. With that particular thing, I remember I love telling the story of when we were training in Green River, and at the end he would go around the room. So when are you going to do it? And I remember I was like, well, I'm sure by the time I get to the airport, I'll be having to practice my emotional koan. And it's like, good. That's what Junpo wanted. Something that was going to be something that we showed up soon and now. Where the technology gets left off is like, okay, great. I did an emotional koan. I did it once, and that's the end of that. And there isn't really a robust teaching on how to use this in an ongoing way. Okay, which was, I think, somehow the title of this particular talk. So luckily, as we get close to winding down to the end of this, it's like, how do we use this in an ongoing way? Okay, there's a couple of pieces to how we use this in an ongoing way. One is to regularly create a reflective practice on which we are considering our emotional reactivity and working with it. What do I mean by that? Well, journaling is one way of doing that. At the end of the day, the beginning of the day, you can do it at the beginning of the day as part of your meditation. You can just sit down as part of your meditation and say, well, I'm going to reflect on yesterday as like, did I emotionally react to someone? Okay, I'm going to work with that. It doesn't have to be long. It can be 2 or 3 minutes. Right? But we have to remember and choose to do our emotional koan work, or we're not doing it. I'll say that again. We have to remember and choose to do our emotional koan work, or we're not doing it. It's like, oh, good. It's exactly what Hakuin was rebelling against. I've had an awakening experience. We're done. I've had an emotional koan experience. I'm done. It's like, no, that's the beginning, not the end. And the curriculum is called My Life. Each one of us has our own curriculum. We have to do our lives, and we're going to keep emotionally responding. So having a regular reflective practice, which the way to build that muscle is to write something down, but that can eventually become absorbed into just on your meditation cushion, right? Looking back at yesterday, or in anticipating today. Okay. The second piece of emotional koan work is having a relationship, because remember, koans are a relational piece. So having a relationship with a teacher, which is something that is very important to both Soto and Rinzai, is there's a regular form where we can have a conversation about what we're learning about ourselves and what really matters and how that works. There are more techniques than that. The third one is one that I like to teach, which is to notice during our meditations when we find ourselves ruminating rather than meditating on some sort of emotional complex that is getting in the way of our lives. And that is the point where we can actually do this emotional koan work ourselves in the meditation. So this is where cosmopolitan Zen differs from a traditional Zen form, which is the idea is that, well, we're doing a concentration practice, and then if we find ourselves being distracted by some sort of emotional complex, we actually sort of kind of bracket it and then do this emotional koan work. Okay, I'm going to allow myself to be with it. I'm going to notice what's going on with myself. I'm going to deepen my understanding of feeling. Now I'm going to consciously drop and see what it looks like. And oftentimes, and I can teach technique around that, but I'm not going to do that on this particular discussion. Oftentimes, that allows us to make sense of the emotional crystal, emotional complex, and then it usually can fade away and I can go back to my meditation. Okay, so that's a practice that we've identified too. So those are three different ways. One is reflecting with a journal and reflecting self. Number two is being able to have a dialogue with with a teacher. And number three is using our emotional koan technology as part of our meditation as a method for deepening our shamatha practice. I mean, you would say it's essentially, when you're using it that way, it's an insight practice. It's a vipassana practice at that particular moment in time. So we've used these emotional koans in all three ways. Then it just becomes ongoing, essentially. And of course, in Junpo's next step would be then, of course, teaching others, sharing what you're doing, not having it not just be an internal thing. And this is actually one of the unique things about Junpo Roshi. I think I read a lot of the traditional Chan texts, and it's very, very common for the Chan elders to wake up and go disappear into the nowhere lands for 20 or 30 years, right? Which is very close to what the Arhat model was in India, which of course the Chan like to play down as, well, that's not good, we're better than that. But it's amazing how many of these folks actually do that, right? So in Junpo's Zen, it's like, well, if you're really doing the Mahayana vow, then you're actually showing others this particular insight that you're having. Right, so it's like, okay, I can do this work, but it's also nice to go back and actually have a conversation and express to others what you're learning and how, well, here's something that I do, and I'd like to show you how that particular piece works in some way with it. So that really is a fourth way of doing it, a fourth way of doing ongoing emotional koan work. So I think I'd probably come to a good point for me to finish up this talk. I'm appreciative of you all listening. I'm just going to do a quick kind of where we went through. Our journey today took us from the traditional way that koans were developed, which in our modern Rinzai form is from Hakuin, the Japanese. The koans themselves emerged out of the Chan, which is the Chinese word for Zen, in really the 9th, 10th, and 11th century, even though the stories go from before that. Junpo did this curriculum and felt like there was a missing piece, which was the growing up versus waking up. And then he applied this technology, and we went through koan 10, which is the feeling that arises with our awakening. 11, which is to recognize that there's underlying, that our feelings are much more complex, but ultimately it's because it matters, because we care. 12 being the koan that's about recognizing that it's all mine. I got to take care of it. And then 13 is when now we can actually, with immediacy, use this growing muscle of being able to come back to the awakened awareness, and look through our emotions as informations that are helping us see what we care about, and then showing up to others compassionately. And we practice this when we reflect daily on our emotional reactivity, when we reflect either through journals or through our meditation. We can also use it as a technique for our insight practice. And then we share it with others, which is what I'm doing today with this talk. So I thank you all for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Shining bright lotus.